The air inside the packed event hall was thick with anticipation, the low murmur of voices rising and falling like an unpredictable tide. The chandeliers overhead cast a golden glow on the polished marble floors, the clink of crystal glasses, punctuating quiet conversations. This was supposed to be just another fundraiser, another gathering of political elites shaking hands, exchanging favors, and reinforcing the unspoken rules that kept their world in order. Karoline Leavitt knew those rules well, and tonight, she was about to break them. She moved through the crowd with a quiet, deliberate grace, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Dressed in a sleek navy suit, she exuded a calm confidence that made people step aside without realizing they were doing it. She wasn't here for small talk. She wasn't here to smile politely and pretend everything was fine. She was here for a reckoning. At the far end of the room, standing near the bar with a glass of bourbon in hand, was the man she had come for, Senator Richard Calloway, a career politician with a face made for campaign posters. Square jaw, perfect silver hair, the kind of practiced charm that fooled people who weren't paying attention. For years, he had operated in the shadows, his name whispered in conversations about backroom deals and misused power. But Karoline wasn't interested in whispers. She was here to drag him into the light. She caught his eye before he had a chance to look away. His smirk was automatic, the same smirk he had used in 1,000 debates, 1,000 interviews, the kind that said, "I own this room, and I know it." Karoline smiled back, but hers wasn't the smile of a friend. She closed the distance. Between them, with measured steps, the energy in the room shifting as people began to notice. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a photographer subtly raised his camera, sensing something worth capturing. "Karoline," Calloway greeted smoothly, swirling his drink. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." She tilted her head slightly. "Didn't expect you to still be standing." His smirk faltered, just for a second. But that second was everything. Karoline didn't wait for him to recover. She reached into her handbag, pulling out a folded piece of paper. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air charged with the kind of tension that only came when something inevitable was about to happen. "Recognize this?" she asked, holding it up between them. Calloway's eyes flickered to it. And this. Time. The crack in his confidence was more pronounced, because he did recognize it. It was the document that would change everything, and Karoline wasn't about to let him escape. The tension in the room thickened, stretching tight like a wire, about to snap. The golden glow of the chandeliers did nothing to warm the cold silence that had settled between Karoline and Calloway. The senator's fingers tightened around his glass, the ice shifting with a soft clink, but his smirk had faded completely. He knew exactly what she was holding. Karoline kept her expression unreadable, though she could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her. The political donors, the aides, the lobbyists, they had all been locked in their usual rhythms of deal-making and polite deception. But now, they were watching her, waiting. Calloway's voice was smoother than it should have been. "You always did like making a scene, Karoline." She didn't blink. "And you always did like stealing from the people who trusted you." A sharp inhale from somewhere in the crowd. A whispered exchange between two men near the bar. The pressure in the room shifted, no longer just curiosity, but a growing realization that something bigger was unfolding. Calloway let out a slow, calculated chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. He took a sip of his drink, buying himself a second to think. "I'm not sure what you think you have there," he said, his voice steady, but his posture betraying him. Karoline stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so that only he could hear. "Oh, you're sure, Calloway." She tapped the paper against her palm. "You signed it, you funneled it, And now you're going to answer for it. His jaw tightened. There it is, she thought. Fear. She had spent weeks digging into the senator's latest financial dealings, following a trail of carefully disguised transactions that led to a slush fund, one that had been used to bankroll more than just re-election campaigns. Private investments, personal expenses, favors that should never have been paid for with money that wasn't his. He had thought he was untouchable. He wasn't. Calloway straightened, his confidence flickering back to life. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice low and measured. "Whatever you think you know, you don't have the full picture." Karoline's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. "That's what's going to make this fun." She unfolded the document, holding it up just enough for him to see. His eyes scanned the first few lines, and she caught it, the slight twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed around his glass as if he wanted to crush it. It was all the confirmation she needed. Before he could recover, she stepped past him, turning toward the growing crowd. The movement was enough to signal that something big was happening, and suddenly, people weren't just watching anymore. They were leaning in. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting clean through the murmurs, "I think you all deserve to know exactly who you've been writing checks for." Calloway's breath hitched. His mask was slipping, and Karoline knew it. She wasn't going to let him put it back on. The moment stretched unbearably, a thin electric silence crackling through the room. The weight of Karoline's words hung in the air, pressing down on the gathered elites like a storm cloud ready to burst. Conversations had stopped. The waitstaff, once moving with effortless grace between guests, now hesitated at the edges of the crowd. Even the chandeliers, with their soft, golden glow, seemed to flicker under the pressure of what was about to unfold. Senator Calloway didn't move. His grip on his glass was so tight she half expected it to shatter. His carefully constructed world, the one built on influence, deception, and the unshakable assumption that no one could touch him, was beginning to tremble at the edges. Karoline didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She knew he was watching her, measuring his options, calculating an escape route. There wasn't one. She stepped forward, holding the document between two fingers, letting it hover in the air like a blade just inches from its target. "For years," she began, her voice steady but charged, "Senator Calloway has asked for your trust, your support, your money." A ripple of unease moved through the room. Some looked at Calloway, searching his face for an immediate denial. He didn't offer one. Karoline continued, her voice cutting through the growing tension. "But what if? I told you that the donations you so generously provided, money you believed was funding campaigns, policy efforts, the greater good, didn't all go where you thought?" A shift. The rustle of fabric as men adjusted their ties, as women exchanged glances over half-filled champagne flutes. People who had spent years writing checks without question were now questioning everything. Calloway finally moved, stepping forward in an attempt to reclaim the space between them. "Karoline," he said, the smoothness in his voice practiced but strained. "You're walking a dangerous line here. If you think some out-of-context document proves anything, oh, it doesn't just prove something." Karoline's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time all night, she let the full force of her confidence settle into place. "It confirms what people have been whispering about for years. You're corrupt, Calloway. And now, they have proof." She held up the document fully, the overhead lights catching the bold, incriminating figures typed neatly across the page. Bank transfers, shell accounts, off-the-books payments to people whose names sent a shudder through the political world. Someone in the crowd audibly gasped. A man near the bar, a longtime donor, one of Calloway's biggest financial backers, stepped forward, his face dark with realization. "Tell me this isn't true," he demanded. "Tell me you didn't use our money for—" He stopped himself, his voice catching on the weight of what he didn't want to say aloud. Calloway's jaw clenched. The truth was written across his face. Karoline watched it happen, the exact moment his empire began to crumble. The shift in the room, the unspoken understanding that the balance of power had shifted against him. He had spent years making people feel like they owed him, like his influence was unshakable. But tonight, in the space of mere minutes, that illusion had fractured beyond repair. She wasn't done. "Oh, and before you try to spin this?" She reached into her bag, pulling out her phone with calculated ease. "I'd say you have about 30 seconds before this hits every major news outlet in the country." Calloway inhaled sharply, the first sign of real panic flaring behind his eyes. It was over. The room, once a sea of polite conversation and controlled power, had transformed into something else entirely. The donors were shifting away from Calloway, some already checking their own phones, their fingers moving furiously across screens. Karoline let the moment settle before delivering the final blow. "You told everyone in this room they could trust you," she said, her voice deceptively soft. "Now they'll have to decide for themselves whether they still do." She watched him struggle for a response, for a way out. There wasn't one. And then, with one last knowing glance, she hit send. The moment Karoline's thumb pressed send, the air in the room changed completely. It wasn't just tension anymore. It was collapse, the slow-motion disintegration of everything Senator Richard Calloway had spent decades constructing. A low chime from someone's phone cut through the silence. Then another. A domino effect rippled through the crowd as notifications started lighting up screens, the impact of her message spreading in real time. And then the whispers started. Not just idle curiosity or polite gossip, real whispers, the kind that carried weight, that meant reputations were being assessed and alliances were shifting. The donors, the lobbyists, the political operatives, they were suddenly recalculating their positions, reassessing whether standing next to Calloway was worth the fallout that was about to hit him like a train. Calloway knew it too. For a moment, he just stood there, as if sheer willpower alone could stop the walls from closing in. His breathing was measured, but Karoline could see the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of something bordering on desperation behind his carefully controlled expression. "Karoline," he said, his voice quieter now, no longer carrying the same unshakable authority. "Let's talk about this privately." She almost laughed. "Privately?" "No," she said simply, her tone cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "We're past that." He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening around, his drink before setting it down on a nearby table with a sharp clink. He turned slightly, scanning the room, probably searching for an ally, someone, anyone, who would step forward and throw him a lifeline. No one did. The donors were backing away, their body language shifting in subtle but damning ways. Some stared, down at their phones, pretending to be suddenly engrossed in texts that would allow them to avoid direct eye contact. Others had begun drifting toward the exit, their minds already made up. Calloway was dead weight now, and they weren't going to sink with him. One man, a deep-pocketed investor who had been a staple at Calloway's fundraisers for years, finally broke the silence. "Richard," he said, his voice carrying just enough edge to signal his displeasure. "Is there something you'd like to say?" All eyes turned to him. Calloway straightened, clearly trying to compose himself, but his usual air of effortless confidence was cracking. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, forcing a chuckle that sounded anything but natural. "I don't know what she thinks she's uncovered, but—" "I know exactly what I've uncovered," Karoline interrupted. She reached into her bag again, pulling out a second document, a printed spreadsheet this time stapled neatly in the corner. She didn't need it for theatrics. She already had the proof out in the world. But she wanted to make sure Calloway saw it. "The numbers don't lie," she continued, flipping the first page with deliberate ease. "Over $1 million funneled through shell accounts under your control. Transactions that conveniently Don't show up in your campaign's financial disclosures. Money that was supposed to fund policy initiatives. But instead, she let her words trail off, watching him squirm. Calloway shook his head, his smirk returning. But this time it didn't reach his eyes. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice lower now as if trying to salvage some control. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I don't?" Karoline arched an eyebrow. "Then why are the reporters already picking up the story?" More phones buzzed. More heads lowered as people scrolled furiously through news alerts. Calloway's face darkened. He could hear it now, the unmistakable rustle of power slipping from his grasp. Then, the moment that sealed his fate happened. A woman in a tailored emerald dress, someone Karoline recognized as one of Calloway's longtime donors, cleared her throat and stepped forward. Her expression was unreadable, but her tone was cool, measured. "Senator," she said carefully, "I think it's in everyone's best interest if you explain yourself. Right now." Karoline didn't miss the way. Calloway stiffened at the words. Everyone's best interest. The unspoken threat was there. These weren't just rich socialites looking for entertainment. They were the people who had funded him, who had expected their investments in him to be protected, and now those investments looked like liabilities. Calloway's hands flexed at his sides. For the first time all night, Karoline saw something other than arrogance in his expression. Uncertainty. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Silence. The longer he hesitated, the deeper the knife twisted. Karoline didn't move. She didn't need to. This was his moment to fight back. And he couldn't. Because he knew, just as she did, that there was no way out. One of the younger political aides, who had been nervously lingering at the edge of the confrontation, whispered something to his colleague. Karoline caught just a bit of it. "This is bad. Really bad." It was bad. It was the kind of moment that would be replayed for weeks, maybe longer. The kind of scandal that didn't just fade, it festered, growing larger with every headline, every leaked detail. The only question left was how Calloway would go down. Would he fight to the bitter end, clawing at whatever scraps of dignity he had left? Or would he do what Karoline suspected, what politicians like him always did when the game turned against them? Cut a deal. Find an escape hatch. She tilted her head, watching as the full weight of realization settled over him. This wasn't just a political attack. This was his end, and Karoline had delivered it with precision. The room held its collective breath, waiting for his next move. Would he deny? Would he lash out? Would he storm out in a final act of defiance? Or would he do the one thing he had spent his entire career avoiding? Would he fall? The weight of the moment was suffocating. The room, once buzzing with effortless conversations and whispered deals, had become a silent jury box, all eyes fixed on Senator Richard Calloway. His face, usually a mask of unshakable control, had turned stiff. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if it might crack under the pressure. Karoline Leavitt watched him carefully, absorbing every flicker of emotion that passed through his expression. Rage, denial, calculation, and finally, a creeping realization of the inevitable. He was cornered. The crowd had shifted subtly, the balance of power already tilting away from Calloway. He was no longer the man to impress, the kingmaker in the room. No, that title belonged to her now. Karoline knew exactly how this worked. People in politics weren't loyal to people. They were loyal to power. And power, like money, had a way of moving fast when it was threatened. She could already see it happening. The longtime donors who had once gravitated toward Calloway were taking slow, deliberate steps backward. Some feigned distraction, sipping their drinks or pretending to check their phones, unwilling to make eye contact with the man they had propped up for so long. Others weren't even trying to hide their disgust. One of them, an older businessman in a sharp charcoal suit, exhaled sharply and shook his head. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath. Loud enough for those around. Him to hear, that was it. The first domino. Once one person decided it was over, the others would follow. Calloway must have realized it too, because his entire posture shifted. The false bravado, the smug amusement that had carried him through scandal after scandal, was gone. What remained was something raw, almost frantic. "Let's be rational about this," he said, his voice lower now, meant only for Karoline. She tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "Rational?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "You and I both know this game, Karoline. You think you've just ended me, but things don't work that way. I've survived worse than this." The fact that he said it with conviction, like it was just another fire to put out, another mess for his PR team to clean up, was almost laughable. She stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough so that only he could hear her next words. "You've never faced me before." The flicker of doubt in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. For the first time, it truly hit him. This wasn't going to blow over. And then, the reporters arrived. The doors at the back of the event hall swung open, and a small but determined group of journalists pushed their way in, cameras at the ready. Someone had tipped them off, probably one of the donors looking to salvage their own reputation before it got dragged into Calloway's downfall. The flashes erupted in quick succession, the sound of shutters clicking filling the room. "Senator." "Calloway!" a woman's voice rang out, cutting through the thick tension. "Care to comment on the allegations?" Calloway turned his head sharply, his expression twisting into something between anger and disbelief. "This is a private event," he snapped. That wasn't going to stop them. Karoline stayed silent, watching as the feeding frenzy began. More questions flew at him, each sharper than the last. "Is it true you embezzled over $1 million? In campaign funds? Do you deny the transactions in the leaked documents? Will you be resigning?" The last question sent a visible jolt through Calloway's entire body. Resign? That wasn't a word he was used to hearing, much less considering. His eyes darted around the room looking for support, but there was none left. No one was coming to his defense. And then, the final dagger. Someone pulled out their phone and hit play. A recording, scratchy but clear enough, filled the space between them. Calloway's voice. "Just move the money around. It doesn't matter where it comes from as long as we keep the numbers clean on the books." A full-body hush swept through the crowd. Calloway's face went pale. "Where the hell did you get that?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. But it didn't matter. It was over. Karoline could feel it in the air, in the way the donors were already stepping away, in the way the reporters were sharpening their pens, in the way Calloway's hands twitched, like a drowning man realizing the tide had turned against him. He was out of options. Karoline could have twisted the knife. She could have leaned in and whispered something cruel, something final, something that made it clear she had won. But she didn't need to. Instead, she simply met his gaze, offered a small, almost pitying smile, and turned away. She didn't need to watch the rest of his downfall. She had already ensured it. The sound of the recording lingered in the air like a funeral bell, its weight settling over the room with suffocating finality. The crowd stood frozen, their faces painted with a mixture of shock, anger, and dawning realization. Richard Calloway, the untouchable senator, the political titan, the man who had built his career on careful deception and backroom deals, had just been laid bare in front of everyone who once swore loyalty to him. Karoline didn't need to press play again. The damage had been done. Calloway's face had gone from pale to red, his breathing just slightly uneven, the subtle signs of a man who had lost control for the first time in his career. His fingers twitched at his side like he wanted to grab something, his drink, the paper in Karoline's hands, anything that would give him a sense of stability. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The reporters were relentless now. They weren't just asking questions. They were demanding answers. Senator, do you deny this is your voice? Will you be stepping down from office? Have you spoken to legal counsel? Each question hit him like a brick, and Karoline could see it, really see it, the way his defenses were crumbling in real time. For so long, Calloway had been the one who dictated the rules, who controlled the message, who could spin any accusation into a misunderstanding and any scandal into a political asset. But this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of his end. He turned to his donors, his last hope, his last grasp at salvation. But they were already gone. Not physically. Most of them still stood in the room, but the shift had already happened. Their expressions were carefully blank, their hands wrapped around half-finished drinks that none of them seemed interested in anymore. One by one, they were severing themselves from him, their years of loyalty replaced by cold calculation. Because Calloway was no longer an asset. He was a liability. Karoline knew this moment was coming. It always did. The second the powerful sensed the winds shifting against them, they did what they had always done. Protected themselves. And Calloway? He was beyond protecting now. Finally, someone spoke. A woman in a dark emerald dress, one of Calloway's longest financial backers, someone who had stood by him through election after election, took a slow step forward. Her voice was cold, unforgiving. I trusted you. Calloway's eyes snapped. To hers. She shook her head. I trusted you. And you used us. All of us. That was it. The first public crack, and once the first one broke, the rest followed. I'm done, another voice called out. A deep, smooth voice belonging to an older man in a tailored suit, someone Calloway had once called a friend. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice so there would be no mistake. I will no longer be contributing to this man's campaigns, nor will I stand behind him in any capacity. Calloway's mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but nothing came out, and then the exodus began. One after another, the donors, the lobbyists, the operatives, the strategists, his people, started walking away. Some did it in silence, turning on their heels and heading toward the exits without another glance. Others did it with deliberate finality, tossing their drinks onto a nearby table, adjusting their coats, sending a clear message. We're done. Karoline just stood there, watching. She didn't need to say anything else. The work was done. Calloway wasn't just losing his reputation, he was losing his network. The web of influence that had shielded him, that had allowed him to operate in the shadows for so long, was being ripped apart piece by piece. Finally, he turned to her. For the first time that night, his mask was gone. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't smug or dismissive or condescending. He just looked lost. This isn't over, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Karoline tilted her head slightly, studying him. It is for you, and with that, she turned on her heel and walked away, stepping past the reporters, past the stunned guests, past the remnants of what used to be his domain. The event hall doors swung open as she pushed through them, the cool night air hitting her skin in an instant. She inhaled deeply, feeling the crispness of it fill her lungs, washing away the remnants of tension still coiled in her body. A car was waiting for her at the curb, its sleek black surface reflecting the glow of the city lights. As she stepped toward it, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out. A message. Unknown number. Well played. Karoline smirked. She didn't need to respond. Instead, she slipped into the back seat of the car, crossing one leg over the other as the door shut behind her. The driver pulled away from the curb, merging into the flow of traffic, the hum of the city filling the silence. She didn't look back. Calloway would be dealing with the aftermath for weeks, maybe months. His name would be dragged through every news cycle, his face plastered across headlines, his staff scrambling for damage control that would never be enough. And by the time the dust settled, he would no longer be a senator. But Karoline, she was just getting started.